Welcome to Get Ready for the Answer, where I'll answer all of your recording, mixing, and music business questions. Hi, I'm Bobby Owsinski. I'm a producer, an author, blogger, podcaster, and a bunch of other things as well. You might know me from my books. The newest ones are on the bottom. And this one in particular is used in colleges all over the world, Mixing Engineer's Handbook. It's been a standard since 1999. You might know me from my Inner Circle podcast. We're up over 550 episodes now. You might know me from my blogs, music production blog, and a music industry business blog. Or my courses, a number of online courses. Maybe you're a part of them. Maybe you might be in the future. The questions today come from a particular source. In December, we did the Awesome Mix Workshop, and it was a 3-day live workshop of which we had several hundred questions that were submitted. I didn't get to them all, so I want to get to them now. And this is part 2, actually, of just mix balance and panning questions. So let's get to them. From Brian, he says, when you mentioned about the gain staging part, the VU meter levels of each instrument will be in relation to RMS, like minus 18 dB, or is it only in relation to true peaks only? I think you're getting things confused. Now, this comes from the workshop, actually, where I showed you some things on gain staging. But let me explain why gain staging is important. First of all, gain staging is used, it used to be used in analog, not only to get a nice clean signal, but to get a loud signal. So we used to turn it up as loud as we could without distortion. The reason why is the noise would stay here, and the louder you can get it, the less you'd hear the noise. Well, that's no longer the case in digital, so we can get it nice and even level. It doesn't have to be too loud. We don't want it to be too quiet, but it doesn't have to be too loud. And usually between minus 10 and minus 6, somewhere in there, is a good spot to be. Like I say, you can be less. So none of this relates to VU meter levels, because in digital, we don't use VU meters so much. The reason why is they don't act fast enough. And all engineers, even back in the analog days, would prefer to have peak meters, but they weren't available. They're just too expensive if you can make them. And now we can have them easily in digital audio workstations. So that's the standard default meter for most digital audio workstations. So it doesn't relate to RMS levels. You can have an RMS meter if you want, but I think you're much better off with a peak meter. So really what you want to do, again, you're always aiming and recording for something between minus 10, minus 12, and maybe a peak of minus 6. And it gives you a nice solid level. If it's less than that, it's okay. And there's some people that go for minus 18, minus 20. The only problem with that is at some point in time, you're going to have to crank it up a little bit. Okay, from Sand. It's so important to start all mixes at minus 20 and slowly build up from there, but creating sync for TV is different. No, it's not that important to start at minus 20. And again, if you go back to the analog days, that might be the case, where we started fairly low and we built it up. Today, not so much. And the reason why, we have stuff all over the mix bus that we can control the levels pretty much. So that's not as much of an issue as it used to be. But you're talking about creating for sync for television. No, you don't do anything different at all. You make the best mix you can, and that's what you send. The levels are no different. Nothing is different. You just make it sound as good as you can and send it. I actually just went through this. I had Chris SD, who's an expert on sync licensing. He was did a special podcast, actually a special webinar, Zoom call out to some of my subscribers, talking about this. Just make it as good as you can. Don't worry about different levels. From Eve, when you say drums first, is there an order for kick, snare, etc.? Okay, so what he's referring to, in the last workshop that I did, we talked about getting a good balance. And one of the major problems with balance is vocal balance. and not being able to get that right balance because it's either too loud or too soft. And the reason for that is a lot of mixers, musicians will get this great mix going and they'll wait until the end. The very last thing is the vocal, and that's what they bring in. But by then, there's no space for it. So what you have to do then is, it's either too loud or too soft. So my suggestion is to get the vocal in as soon as possible into the mix. My prescription for that is do the drums first, then the bass, then put the vocal in, and then build the rest of the mix around it. And that way your vocal's always pretty much at the right level. So that's where a lot of this comes from. So he's saying, okay, if you do the drums first, is there an order? Kick, snare, whatever. Yes, most people start with the kick and then the snare, and then they build everything around that, and then the hat. I'd say that's the most common way to build a mix. It's not the only way. As a matter of fact, you could do it from the snare first. You can do it from the vocal first. Back in the day, in the early analog days, before we started to record drums on separate tracks, when we didn't have the ability to do that, the bass was always first. You got the bass in the mix, and then you built around that. So that was very, very common in songs throughout the 60s and early 70s, actually. And it's only into the modern era of recording and mixing that we got into this, where drums are each in their own separate track. So then we have to build a mix. But again, it's somewhat arbitrary. What do you like? What works best for you? I know mixers that start from the overheads and then build around that. So most commonly you do the kick first and the snare and the hat and then everything else. But it's not the only way to do it. From Mike D, how important are LUFS for streaming services and how to not lose the overall impact? Well, I don't know about the overall impact. Let's start with the first one. How important are LUFS for streaming services? Not important at all. Ignore that. The only time you should be concerned with LUFS is when you're supplying a mix for television, and even then, if you're the last mixer in the chain and your mix is going directly to the channel, that's the only time you need to be concerned with it. And it's the same with commercials. The very last person in the chain is the one that's concerned with the LUFS levels. Nobody else. Doesn't matter. And it's the same thing with streaming networks. They may specify they're at minus 16, minus 14, whatever it might be, but really what they're talking about is they re-encode it to get to that level. So if you send something in that's at minus 2 or minus 20, doesn't matter, it gets re-encoded. Don't concern yourself with LUFS at all. And the second part, how not to lose the overall impact. I'm not sure what you mean there. I think maybe what you mean is if you're trying to get a certain LUFS level, you lose the overall impact. That shouldn't happen. You should be able to turn things down fairly easily without worrying about that. But again, don't worry about LUFS. Just make it sound as good as possible at the level that you feel is competitive with everything else. Okay, from Brett. I have high-pitched tinnitus. Me too. It's raging right now. What should I be aware of when mixing with that in mind? I've had tinnitus since I've been a kid, and I think what started it was when I was a teenager, playing in my first band, and everything was way, way loud, and I've had it ever since. I've learned to ignore it. The only time I think about it is when I read something about tinnitus or somebody mentions it, and then I go, oh, yeah, there it is. So right now, I just noticed how loud it is. But that being said, again, I think in part one of this particular category, we talked a little bit about this as well. What I would suggest is you send a mix out to a really good mastering engineer. It's worth spending the money. First of all, you'll learn something. You'll get a really good mastering job. But second of all, you'll find out more how your tinnitus is actually interacting with the song, with the mix, I should say, because the mastering engineer will tell you. usually by saying something like, your high end is really hot. 10K is really hot, or 8K is really hot, or something like that. Pick a frequency that might be. If it's tinnitus, it's probably more like 4 or 5, somewhere in there. That said, once you get that information, then you adapt. So in your next mix, okay, I'm tempted to boost it at 4.5K, but I know that I shouldn't, or not boost it as much. So that's the best way that I've found. Okay, from Bruce. I've heard that the snare and lead vocal are relatively at the same volume. If so, why? Is it a good rule of thumb? Yes, it is. It's a good rule of thumb to start that way. It doesn't mean that that's the way it'll end up. Generally speaking, you're going to have a kick, snare, and vocal somewhat at the same level. You're going to start there anyway. And what will happen is, depending on the genre of the song and the arrangement and everything, that's going to change. For instance, there are different vocal levels in different genres. So pop, for instance, and country to some degree, the vocal is way in front and it's leading. It's way loud. In rock, it's just the opposite. It's somewhat buried in the mix. And the reason for that is to emphasize the power of the band. In sometimes hip hop, we have that, so we emphasize the beat. And even in EDM, you have that. So it depends on the genre of music of where that vocal is going to sit. From Dal, how wide is too wide in general? I don't think you ever want to put anything hard left and hard right except for reverbs and delays and stuff like that. Reverb, really. I would say 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock are probably as far as you ever want to go. And the reason why is, and I explained this last time, exit sign effect. In the movies, they found this out when they went to stereo, that if they pan something hard left, for instance, then the audience wound up looking at the exit sign, and you don't want that. So in music, it's the same thing, where if you pan something too wide, it takes your attention away from the center, and the most important mix elements are in the center. So that's why you don't want it to be too wide, because you're distracting from the most important mix elements. From Ralph, how would you pan background vocals, both unison and harmonies, repeating the lead vocals? There's a strategy for this. And this almost goes back to what we just talked about in panning, where almost always the lead instrument is dead center and the bass or low frequency instruments are dead center. And the reason why on low frequency instruments, it's really easy for the mix to lean if you put them off to one side. So the mix feels like it's coming out of one speaker more so than the other. And we use that strategy here at background vocals. So for instance, let's say it's a 3-part harmony. And it's not uncommon to not duplicate them, to double them. And if you don't double them, then you might use something that will give you a double, a delay, a flange, or something like that. But getting back to panning, what we try to do, it's 3 parts. The lowest part goes towards the center. The highest part goes the farthest outside. So that way, again, lowest stuff is in the center and the mix doesn't feel unbalanced. And that's generally the way we do that. And it works. It's a great strategy. It works really, really well. I don't want that high vocal to be too panned. Sometimes you'd be surprised with high frequency mix elements. You just have to go a little bit to get the feeling that it's panned. Oh, from Kale. What's good volume for 808s behind the kick without a sidechain? Depends on the song. This feels like a cop-out, but it's really true. Every song is different. Why? Well, the arrangement is different. The sound of the mix elements is different. Maybe the production is different. Every song is different as a result. So that means that you can't just say, well, it's always supposed to be at this volume. You can try things constantly. I'm going to start at this volume and see what happens, but it doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. What it means is this is a good place to start. And with an 808, because you can tune it, it's hard to say what that level should be. Is it tuned high? Is it tuned low? That will make a big difference. How about the kick? Is it a lot of low end or not? And all that makes a big difference, because if the 808 is applying the deep lows to a kick, then it'd be a different level than if it was the other way around. So hard to say, but this is what you have to think of, though. You have to think, okay, what does each one sound like, and do they complement one another? From Jimmy, my mixes don't quite fill the sound field like the reference tracks do, and I'm not sure what you mean by that. Do you mean panoramically? In other words, a sound field left to right? Do you mean frequency-wise? And frequencies are important. If you mean that, chances are you're not paying attention enough to the recording that you're doing. And that means that anything that you're recording, you're just doing it. You're not thinking about the sound and how it fits with the mix. So generally, that's why. So you have kind of weak sounding recordings. Another thing that it could be is that, and let's just say it's panoramic. What you'll have are really good sounding reverbs that will give you that feeling that it's wide, and good sounding reverbs on hit tracks, and that's probably the reference tracks that you're using. So, it could be that, and you just don't have a really good sounding reverb, or you haven't set it up in such a way where it's giving you that feel. All this stuff is really important, and it takes time. It's not just something that you can say, okay, this is good enough. It takes time. Okay, for Emmanuel, is there a different trick to mixing hip hop? Yeah, sort of. And again, the reason why is the kick instrument, the kick mix element, is so prominent, and that takes up so much of the frequency space in the track, that you have to think about that and think about how everything fits around that. So imagine your mix frequency-wise, the frequencies, as a 5-pound bag. You can't fit any more in there. You get 5 pounds, that's it. So if your kick is taking up 3 pounds of that, then everything else has to take up 2 pounds, can only take up the rest of the bag. That's it. And that's the way that works. You can't make everything sound big because it just won't fit. So that's the trick. It's like, okay, this has to sound really big, but is it too big? And if it is, or are my other mix elements small enough so they fit? Small enough meaning fewer low frequencies. Okay, for Mark D, any suggestions for mixing two basses, one playing traditional foundation role and second soloing, a la Stanley Clarke? I believe Ken Scott was one of Stanley's engineers. I wrote a book with Ken Scott. Ken Scott was one of the 5 Beatle engineers. He was also David Bowie's producer in the early days, Supertramp and a lot of those bands. But he did a lot of jazz, and he did, Stanley Clarke, for instance. So what happens is, and we come back to this whole thing of there's only so much space in the mix. And we're talking frequency space, top to bottom. So we have to have everything fit in there. So you can't have two basses that have a lot of low end. So generally one fills the low end and the other fills the high end. Let's solo, for instance, would have less low end because it doesn't need it, first of all. And second reason, it would get in the way. And that's what we're thinking about all the time. How do I fit these things together? But it's also how much room do I have? And how do I fit this all together? Because there's only so much space, frequency space. Okay, from James. Say you have something that's a pad or softer element at the start of a song or an outro. What kind of master meter level would you suggest? A pad is a long sustained note or chord. Instruments that usually provide that could be strings, could be a synthesizer, could be an organ, for instance. It could be big guitar power chords even. So just long sustaining notes. And if you have something that's quiet at the beginning or end of a song, first of all, who says that it has to be loud if it's appropriate? But the other thing is, just because you have a fader level that works for most of the song, there's nothing to say that you can't boost it up at the beginning and the end so it's louder. And that's what happens often. Many people that just start to mix end up with static mixes. Static mixes meaning you get all the fader levels and then you never touch them after that. Where most great mixers are moving faders a lot. And they're moving them with the track, so everything breathes with the track. And when things have to be louder, they make them louder, and they have to be softer, they make them softer, and quieter, I should say. So that's an art in itself to be able to do that. And this is part of automation. So you're automating it, so you only have to do it once, and then tweaking it from there. But again, there's no one level. Whatever works. And see, the other thing is, it's hard to say what that pad is, because if there's a lot of high frequencies, it would sound louder than something that's just lower frequencies. From Rebecca, I find myself overly relying on reverb to add a larger, more expansive effect on my tracks. Is there any way to create that expansive, wider, dreamy feeling of all elements in my mix without relying on reverb for everything? I'm having that muddiness issue you talked about. Okay, so with reverbs, there's numerous things that we can talk about. The first thing is, don't assume that you have to use one reverb. Most mixers are going to use 3, 4, 5. They'll dedicate one just on a vocal. So it sounds great on that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if it gets muddy, you usually have to pull some of that low end out. And almost all the time, you're rolling off low end. What does that mean? Well, you're rolling it off to at least 200. So at 200, it rolls off quickly. And in many cases, 500 or 600, it rolls off. And that way it fits better in the mix. So make sure you're doing that. Between those two things, you'll find that you can add more reverb and it will sound more natural. From William, how can you make your mixes sound more realistic? For example, recorded drums are glued together with the sound from other kit parts. Okay, so I think what you mean is, how can you make virtual drums sound more realistic? So what happens with real drums when you're recording them, there's leakage from mic to mic, and that's just part of the drum sound. You don't worry about that. As a matter of fact, you embrace it because that's part of the sound. And if it's a good sounding kit, it just makes it sound better. You don't have that with virtual drums, or you do with loops sometimes, but with virtual drums you don't. So you have to create that, and the best way to do it is with a reverb. So it might be, many times this is what happens. There'll be a separate reverb on the snare drum, and that will be giving you some sort of effect. It might be reverse, it might be a nonlinear reverb, something like that. A short room, in other words, a decay time that's less than 1 second, way less than 1 second. And what you'll find here is that there's one reverb. It's usually a room sound that's a little bit on everything, and that ties it all together. So there's one drum kit reverb. It's a room, so it should be relatively short. It'll probably be 1 second, 1.2 seconds, 0.8 seconds, something like that. That's what you do. So that's the end of our mix, balance, and panning category. The end of part 2. So thanks so much. The next time we do this, I think it's going to be the production category. So we're going to talk all about music production, and this is the questions that I got from that last workshop that we did. And there's a lot of really, really good questions in there. So look forward to that. It should be pretty good. With that, let me turn you on to this. This is my mixing crash course. It's free. So you can learn 3 techniques that the top pros use, one for balance, one for EQ, one for compression. And what you'll hear are some of the things that we talked about today. So go to mixingcrashcourse.com. You'll see and hear some of the things that we talked about today. mixingcrashcourse.com. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for listening. If I answer one of your questions, I hope I answered it to your satisfaction. If not, drop me a line. We'll figure it out. But until next time, I will see you later.